Hello, and welcome to this month's Open Research Office. Thank you all for joining us. So we're pleased to welcome Zach Chakan, an IRB Administrator, as our presenter. His topic today is Pathways to IRB Review. Zach, thank you so much for helping us out today and providing us with this education. If anyone has questions throughout this session, feel free to just voice them at any point using the raise hand option or put them in chat. If you'd prefer. So we do plan on having some time at the end for questions, but if any come up during the session, Zach would be perfectly happy to address them at that time. So that covers everything on my end. Zach, thank you again for presenting today's Open Research Office.
Absolutely. And thank you, Marshall and Alexis, for setting this all up and for all your support at the beginning. And hopefully we all learn a little bit of something, or at least this helps us in some way understand everything that the IRB does a little bit more. Because sometimes the IRB can seem a little scary or, as part of the whole process, but hopefully we don't want it to be that way. We want it to be very cordial back and forth, and for it to be as easy as possible amidst we're trying to do the software and submit everything and get your study approved. So hopefully this presentation will help to understand a little bit more of how the process works through IRB and through CLIC from beginning to end, and maybe wondering, hey, where's my study at, or what's going on if it's at any particular stage along the way. So I'm Zach Chakan. I am an IRB administrator. I have been with the IRB for almost 7 years now. Actually, I think it just turned 7 years this month. So I've been here for a while. I started out as a meeting coordinator for board meetings, and now I've been reviewing studies for the last 5 years for not greater than minimal risk research studies. So we'll get going here. Today's topics. I was originally going to do this presentation pretty much about what happens after you submit your study. But then it sort of hit me that there could be people signed up who have never submitted to the IRB before, or don't know a lot about CLIC or a lot about the submission process and what needs to be done. So I'll spend a little bit of time. I'll try not to take too much time up about that, because we can always answer questions afterwards, or I'm always happy to answer emails or phone calls after the fact to help along with that process. So we'll talk a little bit about the beginning of submitting and what is generally required or what is needed, some common documents and templates that are used for the IRB, the IRB pre-review process, which is usually where sometimes your study may be sitting for a little while and you're a little bit unsure about what's going on. So we'll talk a little bit about that. The difference between exempt, expedited, and full board review levels, and pretty much a typical timeline for IRB review. And maybe we'll get a frequently asked question or two along the way as well. So what is the IRB, the Institutional Review Board? We review every single research study that is conducted by university personnel in order to comply with the good old government regulations. The 45 CFR 46 is sort of the regulation number for that. But it's now known as the common rule. Everyone knows a little bit about the Belmont report and a lot of sort of why regulations were put into place from years and years ago, from hearing about the Tuskegee experiments and the Zimbardo experiments and things of that nature, which is why IRBs were put into place. And one thing that I really want to emphasize with this is that the IRB is supposed to remain as independent as possible, but we are on your side. We do not want to hold up research. We don't want to prevent research from happening, but we do have regulations that we have to uphold and checklists that we have to fill out to make sure that certain regulations are being followed the way that they're supposed to for research. So we are always happy to assist you as much as possible along the way and when conducting or when you're preparing your research study for us. And you can always ask any of us questions at the IRB if you've got a problem along the way. But hopefully this presentation will help to answer some of maybe your frequently asked questions that you have during the whole process. So first, we have most of you have probably heard of or used Click. Click is the software platform that we use for submitting and reviewing research studies. I believe this presentation will be available later, so there is a link here to click on if you've never clicked on it before. And of course, click does mean you click about 1,000 times throughout just about everything that you do with the IRB, so it's very aptly named. But and if you don't have a Click account and you need to get research started, or you need to get on a research study, please feel free to email me or to email the IRB, and we will give you instructions on how to do that. And there's usually only about a 24-hour turnaround time or less to get you a Click account. So for a lot of research studies, and this is actually more in Alexis's and Marcel's wheelhouse here, many studies submitted to the IRB go through the central study registration process first, and a lot of you may know about that, and Alexis and Marcel could probably talk about that a little bit better than me. But there are a large amount of studies that sort of require to go through central study registration before it goes into the IRB and Click, because central study registration actually talks to Click and can create a new study submission for you in that process. You will still have to fill out more of the finer details in your submission, but if you submit to in Click and it's required through the university to go through central study registration, we will ask you to withdraw your study and it will go back into CSR to be completed. And some of the main reasons why your study would not apply for central study registration would be if you're asking for determination of non-human subjects research or seeking exempt status for your study. If your research does not meet the definition of clinical research, although chart reviews are required to be submitted to central study registration, or if your research is originating from a non-health science school at UB and is not a clinical trial. Alexis and Michelle, does that sound pretty much up to speed with the requirements for central study registration?
Yep, that sounds right.
Okay. And I have Kim Brunton's email on here, and I know it'll be, you may already know how to contact Alexis and Marcel, but they can all answer questions about central study registration better than we can at the IRB, but it's a very symbiotic process in order to make sure that your study is submitted and to Click the right way.
And also Kim Brunton did a very thorough presentation on central study registration that we have in our Open Research Office modules or recordings. So if anyone's interested in that, they can check that out as well.
Sounds good. So if your site does not require central study registration, you can choose the Create New Study box in the IRB tab of Click. So I put a little post up just to show what it looks like, because there's a lot of things if you go into Click and you've never been there before, where do you start? What do you go to? There's a button there that says Create New Study, and you should be able to click on that to do that. You can also do it from the My Inbox tab in your Click profile. So there are a lot of documents and templates that are commonly used, or we recommend that you use for most research studies. The primary one is the HRP 503 study protocol. Every study that gets submitted to the IRB should have a 503 study protocol submitted, no matter what your determination is going to be, even if it's a non-human subjects research determination that you're seeking. We are hoping to provide more versions of the protocol in the future. We also have a retrospective chart review only protocol that is used for medical retrospective chart reviews that we ask that you use instead of the 503. It's called the 503R. But every study that comes in the Click should have some version of the 503. Sometimes if you are doing a sponsored study where there's a 500-page sponsored study, you have that main protocol in your submission, but we have a 508 site supplement where it's only UB specific details that are included. So we require that in those cases. The 502 consent form is another very commonly used document that we require for most studies. We'll talk a little bit more about that later with exempt research. Because there's also other consent forms like parental permission consent and assent for 14 to 17-year-olds or 7 to 13-year-olds, and potentially assent of a legally authorized representative. There's signature pages on the back there. So we've got HIPAA waiver documents, data collection sheets or code keys, study questionnaires and surveys are some common documents. And if you are using REDCap, we ask that you actually upload the actual REDCap PDFs so that we can confirm. I know there's been times where people have submitted questionnaires to us and then had PDF documents and they've been different. So that's why it's important to actually see what those REDCap PDFs are. And recruitment documents such as study flyers or recruitment scripts. And a lot of these certain documents and especially templates are available in the Click library under the templates tab. And whenever you're looking along your screen, there's a nice horizontal line there, and you can see that's what the library is, one of the options that you should have to choose from. The general tab under library includes a lot of helpful documents, including research training requirements and what we call tips from the IRB on specific topics. We're constantly trying to create more of those kinds of documents to provide more guidance to the research community. But there's about 10 topics or so there now. And if you have any questions that you don't feel like are on there, you can always let us know. We can try to answer them the best way that we can. I won't talk too much about this, but there's research training requirements, which a lot of you probably know about to some degree, but we use the city training modules to conduct or to complete research training, to complete the government regulations on that regard. I have the link there to log in or create your city account if you have not yet done so, if you're somebody new. And maybe another university doesn't use city, although a lot of universities do use city. But we can only see what courses you have completed through the University of Buffalo. And if you need help with affiliating your account to Buffalo, you can contact us there as well. But for all biomedical and clinical studies, you are required to complete the City Conflicts of Interest course and the Biomedical Research Investigators course. And in many cases, the Good Clinical Practice course is required. It used to be that we required that for all cases, but that was recently changed. But there is still a good portion of individuals who will need that GCP course. There's also conflict of interest, which is sort of works a little bit with our office. It's similar to, I didn't mention this in the last slide, but with research training requirements, we can't actually approve your study until all of the training courses are complete and all the conflict of interest requirements are complete. So it could be very well possible that all of your submission materials are ready to go and you could be approved. But if all study team members don't have their training done, or they don't have their conflict of interest annual disclosure filled out, and that there's no conflicts, then we won't be able to approve the study until that's done. So it's very important to get these things done, whether you're a study team member on a study so that your part is complete, or if you're the PI, to make sure that everyone else has their ducks in a row and is doing what they're supposed to do. Because that's also the case for annual continuing reviews or for modification. We don't check it at modifications unless you're adding somebody new, and then obviously we have to check that there. But we do check the conflict of interest and the research training requirements at every continuing review as well. So it's important to keep up to date on those. Everyone at the university who conducts research is required to complete an annual conflict of interest disclosure. Actually, I believe this week is sort of everyone might have gotten an email in the whole university the new fiscal year for research, I believe, is just started or is about to start, and we have to have an annual disclosure in for everybody by a certain time. I believe that might be the end of October or something like that. So they created new disclosures for the next year in the last week sometime. So a lot of people would have gotten those, and you have to make sure that those are complete. This can be done within Click, but it's sort of separate from IRB. There's a separate COI tab, and a couple people in our office, Kyle Mann is the COI administrator, And Val Bellani, our administrative assistant, helps out with some of these as well. So you can always contact either of them if you have issues or problems with completing your conflict of interest information. So that was a little bit of a crash course. Maybe at some point we can go have a different one of these where we go section by section into the click submission itself and show whatever all that looks like. But for this, I think that hopefully covers a lot of the submissions process. But does anyone have any questions about that as of now, of sort of the early stages before you actually submit your research study? Good. So yeah, we'll go ahead then. So I've submitted my research study. What in the world happens next? Where does it go? If I had any technological skills whatsoever, I probably would have put some kind of like abyss picture or something in here, but it does not go to the abyss. We will know where your study is. So IRB pre-review, what happens after you submit your study? Someone called an IRB intake coordinator, there's two different ones in our office, will make an initial assessment of the study risk level based off of the materials that you have submitted to us in your click submission. So if your study appears to be greater than minimal risk, it will go to what we call an IRB meeting coordinator, which is the job that I initially had when I started. And we'll go toward the full board review track, which means it's going to go to a board meeting where faculty members of the university, community members, other potentially people who are affiliated with UB but are not professors or faculty members could also serve on the IRB and go to board meetings to provide their opinions or their expertise on certain matters. They review the greater than minimal risk studies. However, a large majority of the studies that do come in are expected to be no greater than minimal risk. They likely would meet exempt or expedited review criteria, or also not human research criteria. Those would get a triage to an IRB administrator, which could be myself or one of several others, and it goes on the non-committee review track. So what is minimal risk? That sometimes that can be tricky to decipher, but what is sort of defined by the government regulations is the research the probability and the magnitude of harm or discomfort anticipated in the research are not greater than those ordinarily encountered in daily life or during the performance of routine physical and psychological examinations or tests. So that is a pretty good definition in our opinion. There's still room for gray area in there, but sometimes people will think, well, no, yeah, this is, a common surgery or something along a common type of, therapy that happens, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's no greater than minimal risk. So we have to assess that based off of what is an ordinary sort of potential occurrence that could happen for somebody in their daily life. And where this really gets interesting in some ways, or can end up causing a lot of, gray areas, is privacy and confidentiality risks. Because in a lot of no greater than minimal risk research, that's where your primary risks are going to be at for the most part. Because identification of research participants or their responses cannot reasonably place them at risk of liability or be damaging to their financial standing, employability, insurability, reputation, or be stigmatizing. So kind of a good example of that is that you might think that you're completing a survey and all that you're doing is just asking a whole bunch of questions. But if you're asking someone about potential illegal drug use, and they answer yes to that, and there's not proper confidentiality measures in your study, that could elevate your risk level to be greater than minimal risk. So once the initial triage takes place for the pre-review, and it goes to the IRB intake either keeps it with themselves or sends it to the meeting coordinator to go in the full board review track. That individual will check that all required documents are submitted using the current required templates, and they're in the correct location in the Click Smart Forms. We call the Smart Forms each page of the Click submission as you go through the process, such as the basic information page, study team members page. There's like a drugs and devices page, and so on and so forth. The intake or meeting coordinator will assign a conflict of interest review for Kyle or Val to look at. They will verify city course completion for all study team members, and they will note members who have not met all of the requirements for us and to the study team to let them know, hey, this person has not done it yet. Please do so, because we can't approve the research without it. And in certain cases, especially a lot of full board studies and certain expedited studies, they could be sent to Alexis or Michelle again to conduct sort of a little bit of an elevated pre-review to make sure that certain issues are dealt with that may not have been thought of in advance before it actually gets to the IRB for review. And down at the bottom there, you see sort of a nice little chain of where your study may be. And if it's lit up in orange, that's where your study is. And you should see this on just about all of your submissions that you submit to the IRB. It starts at pre-submission, and then it goes, pre-submission means that you haven't actually submitted it yet. And I don't remember if it's actually covered elsewhere, but I will say this now. Probably one of the more, oh no, moments that we get from the IRB is someone who thinks that they've submitted their research study to us, but really they never did because they never clicked the submit button. So always maybe keep in the back of your mind, if you look at this chain that's here, if the pre-submission bubble is lit up in orange, that means that you did not actually submit it to us and it's in your hands. Once it goes to the pre-review button is when it's in our hands, and it's waiting for something, or it's in somebody's queue to review. So otherwise, when you look through the chain down there, pretty much everything at the top is when it's in our hands, except on the first part, when it's in pre-submission. And then everything on the bottom, if there's clarifications requested, that's if we ask for more details or some details to be filled in along the way. So there are different types of research to sort of cover real quickly here. These would also potentially be future presentations in and of themselves, but to get a little bit of a crash course with this, exempt research is the first one we'll talk about. The basic criteria is for exempt is that the research involves no more than minimal risk, especially risk of identification of participants and their responses. And what is really important is that all research activities in the study must fall under exempt categories. So you could have a study that is 99% exempt with everything that they do, but if there is one procedure or one detail that technically does not meet an exempt criteria, we have to review it as expedited. And that's just the way that the government regulations work there. So there are certain cases where you may think that your study is exempt and provide sort of a justification for that, and we will try to go along with that if it's accurate. But if there is one detail about your study that lifts it to expedited, we will have to review it in an expedited manner. And all that really means is that expedited level research is also no greater than minimal risk research, but expedited level research requires a continuing review submission to the IRB every year, whereas with exempt research, you do not have to submit a continuing review every year, and many types of changes you make to your study do not need to be submitted to the IRB. So we have the 312, HRP 312 is the exempt worksheet. That's also available in the Click library. It describes all of the exempt categories. The most common exempt categories that we see at our university are exempt 1 is educational research using normal educational practices, which means there's not any new educational practice going on or any educational intervention. It's just looking at standard education that's going on and maybe comparing it with 2 different types of standardized education practices. Exempt 2 is survey and interview studies, or that also includes focus groups, other those observations, those kinds of activities with adult participants, but not children. Children cannot be, surveys with children cannot be considered exempt 2. Exempt 3 is non-medical benign behavioral interventions and data collection with cognitively capable adults. And exempt 4 is secondary research on existing data where there are no identifiers in the data recorded, including a code or a link to identifiers. So if you're doing a chart review or you're looking at prior data and there's any identifier still in the data, we cannot review it as exempt. So for your study submission, if you think that your study may be exempt or you're hoping to receive an exempt determination, you should submit your completed protocol and other supporting documents into the CLIC system, and you can bypass central study registration, except for chart review studies that must still be entered into central study registration, as we mentioned before. And also in your study in CLIC, there's a section called Add Comment on the left side of the page under Next Steps. And you can always submit a comment and say, we would like to request an exempt determination, or we believe that our study meets exempt status. Something along those lines to sort of help tip us off to prepare for that in advance. So with the actual review process, the pre-review will take place as noted in the prior slide. The study then, after it goes from an intake coordinator, will be assigned to an IRB administrator like myself. And I will take a look at it. And if there's any modifications that are required to meet all of the approval criteria, it will be requested in the CLIC system and not via email. That doesn't mean that we can't communicate via email about certain things, but in order to have the process go and click back and forth to show how everything, how the communication goes and how long all that takes, that will all happen in CLIC. Now, if the IRB determines upon review that the study does not meet criteria for an exempt criteria, you'll be asked to go back and submit in central study registration. That's not really the biggest deal in the world. And it happens very, very rarely after a review takes place that something has to go into central study registration that wasn't there before. But that theoretically could happen. And then when all clarifications are addressed to meet the criteria for approval, including all the city and conflict of interest requirements, we will record an exempt determination in your study and approve it. Then you will have it will show that your study is approved. Excuse me. So the other no greater than min mors category is expedited, which is sort of a level up from exempt. It also involves no more than minimal risk to subjects, including the risk of identification of participants or their responses. And all research activities in the study must fall under an expedited category. There are nine expedited categories. Similar to there's a HRP 312 is the exempt worksheet. We have the HRP 313 expedited worksheet, where we have to look at to make sure that your research fits into one of those categories to be considered expedited. It's certainly possible that a study or that your study activities may seem to be no greater than minimal risk, but if the activity doesn't fit into an expedited category, then it might go to a full board review. We may request or send your submission to the full board to check on that. That is also quite rare because most study activities will fit into at least something as long as it's no greater than minimal risk, but it could happen. But yeah, we're definitely not looking to pass off your studies to try to make them be greater than minimal risk if they don't need to be. But sometimes we really need, especially with board members who may have a higher level of expertise in a particular subject or topic, especially to make a risk determination on something, your study could get sent to the full board for that reason. Some of the common categories of expedited research at UB, I'd say the four most common that we get Expedited category 2, which is blood collection within a specified frequency and volume limits by age and health. There's actually 2 different expedited 2s. One is for children and unhealthy adults, and one is for healthy adults. Expedited 4 is data collection through non-invasive means routinely employed in clinical practice, such as non-contrast MRI, ECG, and ultrasound. So there's definitely a lot of MRI studies or ECG studies going on at the university. Expedited level 5 is definitely the most common because that's where retrospective chart review studies come in. Records review from routine non-research procedures, such as medical or administrative records. And we are required that, so any study that requires HIPAA, whether or a HIPAA waiver, where we would be waiving the requirements of HIPAA to conduct your research, has to fit into an expedited category. We cannot exempt your study at the university if it's a retrospective medical chart review and it involves HIPAA. And expedited category 7 is also very common, which is research on individual group characteristics or behavior, usually using surveys or interviews, focus groups to be the study procedures. And there's a 7A and a 7B for that. The submission process and the review process is pretty much the same as it for expedited as is for exempt. You will be asked to submit your study into central study registration for the most part, if it meets the criteria as we talked about before, and will automatically go into click. Nothing will change with the pre-review process. It will go to an intake coordinator and then be sent to an administrator and go through the non-committee review pathway. Sometimes we could, depending on the type of study, if there's some gray areas or some questions, we may have to consult within other IRB administrators or our superiors or with board members to if there's some certain questions that we have about the study, and we can go back and forth with the investigators or coordinators or other team members as well. And sometimes a study might have to be referred to the full board for review, as I mentioned before.
Zach,
So
if we could kind of return to a question about surveys. Andrea, if you want to just speak up and ask your question.
Sure.
Oh, sure. So if you go back a couple slides, you had for one more, I think. Maybe 2. Sorry, I don't want to make it go back too far.
Oh, no, that's okay. No
For exempt, oh yeah, it looks like for exempt, it says survey and interview studies with adult participants. This would be exempt, but then in your expedited review, you have a similar category that says surveys and adult participants. So what would be the difference between like the types of surveys that would make it exempt versus expedited?
So yeah, that's a good question. It really depends on, well, no matter what, definitely if there's children involved at all who the surveys would be on, it has to be an expedited level review. That's the most common one. But for exempt surveys, if you're only conducting surveys and doing interviews, a lot of the time we will review those studies as exempt if there's nothing about the survey itself that is inherently risky or could have some type of outside, if that person's identity is revealed, if their identity is revealed, it could affect their employability, their anything about benefits they could get. If it got out that someone was, for example, a drug user, that would not be good. So we would probably not review that survey study as exempt. Also, there's a lot of times where many types of intervention studies in some capacity are not exempt, but they also have a lot of surveys involved with it. And that would be something where we would say, yes, there's surveys and you're researching a group of people, but you're doing some type of intervention on them, maybe some type of psychological intervention over the course of 8 weeks, where you might be doing some type of cognitive behavioral therapy on them, and also asking them to fill out surveys or diaries over a course of time. And that is something that would, for example, meet expedited level, because for the most part, interventions cannot be exempt. So a lot of times there's not too many studies that are expedited that only meet this level 7 that's here, this category 7, because if they were only category 7, then you'd have to think, well, it would probably meet exempt 2, which is surveys and focus groups and interviews in adults, unless there's something about the research or the confidentiality procedures that elevate it up to a higher level of review. So that's the most common thing that description that I would say. And again, yeah, anything involving children automatically has to be expedited for surveys and focus groups and interviews.
Got it. Thank you.
You're welcome. Any other follow-ups that you can think of with that, Andrea, or is that, do you think that?
Nope, that's good. You answered my question. Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay. And I think we were just on the next slide after that here, and really just with the expedited review workflow at that point, it's the same as exempt. You know, an administrator like myself might ask for more modifications to your submission in the CLIC system, and we might go back and forth. It could be 1 time, it could be 5 times, hopefully not 5, but you never know. And when all clarifications are addressed and it meets the criteria for approval for us, we and city and COI are done, of course, as I mentioned before, we can approve the study. Full board review is a little different. If the study does not meet exempt or expedited research criteria or not human research criteria, it's referred to the full board for review. Likely it's because it's likely going to be a greater than minimal risk study. The board certainly reviews studies, and they could determine it to be no greater than minimal risk, and then it would be sent back to the administrators for future continuing review. But anything that at the initial review that clearly is greater than minimal risk, or that is sort of in that gray area and we're not sure, goes to the full board for review. Some examples of procedures that are considered greater than minimal risk: X-rays, including DEXA scans, MRIs with contrast media or sedation that are used for research purposes. And, you know, not that if it's done for a clinical reason, but if the sole purpose of that happening is for the research, then that would be considered greater than minimal risk. Randomized treatment studies, especially with drugs and certain types of therapies as well. Studies involving investigational drugs and our devices or off-label use of approved drugs, and behavioral studies involving risky interventions or observations of illegal or stigmatizing behavior, or collecting highly sensitive data from an individual. So this is the most common type of study that across the board, especially in the if it's a biomedical clinical kind of study, would definitely go through central study registration, and it will automatically go into CLIC that way. It might go to Alexis or Marshall for a pre-review as being a clinical research facilitator. The pre-review process will go, as mentioned before, it will go to a meeting coordinator who will then put it on a meeting. And what they do is the meeting coordinators actually assign it to a meeting agenda. And in the last year or so, it was changed that the conflict of interest review must be complete before being assigned to an agenda. We were having situations where individuals would not have maybe their city training done or their conflict of interest reviews done. And we would get the study on a board meeting and then have it be ready for approval. But then site members still wouldn't approve they wouldn't complete their research training or their conflict of interest for months after that. So it couldn't actually be approved. So we now require that, especially the conflict of interest review, be done before putting it on a board meeting. Typically, your study will get assigned to a board meeting, an IRB agenda, 2 weeks in advance to provide IRB members who are on the board meeting for that day time to review the study. Sometimes that could be to 7 to 10 days, but generally we like to try to do that 2 weeks in advance to provide all the board members enough time to review the study. There could be anywhere from 4 to 7 members at a board meeting, because what we have potentially 7 voting members for each of our board meetings, and there are 4 meetings a month now. Many years ago, I think there were different IRBs, and there were 1 meeting of each IRB a month. Now there are 4 meetings a month to try to accommodate all the potential studies so that people aren't waiting as long to get their research reviewed. And meetings are typically the first Monday of the month, the second Tuesday, the third Wednesday, and the fourth Thursday of each month. Or the second Tuesday after the first Monday, so something like that. Because sometimes that isn't always the case depending on how the weeks turn out, but almost always we have 4 meetings a month. So during the full board review process, your study will be reviewed by a committee of IRB members at a convened meeting. Especially for new studies, you may be invited to call into the meeting if you're the principal investigator or a study coordinator, or to have, sometimes they'll ask you to provide your phone number so that in case the board has a question that they feel like could be very easily and quickly answered during the course of the meeting, they may contact you in order to do that, in order to potentially prevent a study from being deferred, especially, or to have what's called a modifications required. So, and that I'll describe that here. The review will result either an IRB approval, modifications required to secure approval, or deferral of the submission, and that will be sent to you in a letter and click. If you get a modifications required determination, that means that your study will meet criteria for approval if minor changes are made where the board will specifically say you must do this or make this change to get the study to meet criteria. And then you have to make that specific change, and it will come back to the IRB administrator who attended the meeting, which could be me, and we can approve it without it going back to a board meeting. But let's say the board says that you must make this change, and then you make that change and 3 other changes that the board didn't request, that will have to go back to another board meeting because they would not have reviewed those other changes. You can also ask to say, or you dispute what the board says, or give a justification for why you don't believe what they said is required, and you could submit that back as part of a cover letter in your submission as well. And a deferral is the final potential option, and that it definitely happens with new studies more so than other submissions that come to the board. And that's if the board is unable to approve the study as it's written, and there's too many questions in order to, or things that need to be changed in order to meet criteria of approval without further clarification on certain topics. So if your study is deferred and you have to make several changes that the board alludes to, that will have to go back to a future board meeting for another review. And generally we try to send it to the same meeting. So let's say your study was on the first Monday of the month meeting, it will try to go back to, if you get it back to us in 2 weeks, we will try to get it back on the following Monday meeting, so the same board reviewers will be there to review your studies, and they will already have the familiarity from reviewing it the first time. Because there are about 30 to 40 members of the board, and mostly they will attend one of the 4 meetings a month. Some people will be available on Monday, some are available on Tuesday, and so on and so forth. But there are other submissions that could come through click, modifications or continuing reviews. They usually follow the same path as your initial study review with the following exceptions. As I briefly did mention this, if your study was determined by the full board to be no greater than minimal risk at its initial study, it could go back to an administrator for, or it would go back to an administrator for an expedited level review in the future at continuing review. Greater than minimal risk studies can be expedited also at their continuing review. If you're close to enrollment, all of your research interventions are complete, and you're only doing long-term follow-up with participants, so you're not conducting any more like drug or device procedures along that vein. Or if a proposed modification to your study might impact the study risk level. So you may have a no greater than minimal risk study that has always been exempt or expedited, and then you want to make a change to it that might affect the risk level. It could actually go to a full board for review, whereas it may not have gone to a full board review in the past. And if you have an adverse event that occurs or some type of non-compliance that occurs, that's reviewed at a level that matches with the severity of what happened and with the level of the study. Those are called reportable new information submissions, or RNI for short, that we like to call them. And it could come to an administrator for review if it's more on the minor side, or it could go to the full board if it's a little bit more egregious. So we typically advise study team members to begin the submission process as early as you can. We recommend at least allowing 2 months for a study to complete the process of approval and click. It could certainly take just a couple of weeks, depending on what our workload is at the time. But there could be a lot of back and forth. There could be other holdups with research training or conflict of interest, anything like that. And you never really know what could happen. So we always try to ask that you try to submit 2 months in advance. For continuing review submissions, where you have to review your study every year, we recommend at least submitting that at least 30 days in advance, and you can submit it up to 90 days in advance as well. And CLIC will send you automatic reminders every 30 days until you get to 30 days, and it'll be 15 days to help remind you to get your continuing review submission in. And typically submissions are reviewed in the order that they're received by us, and we call it in our queue. We try to go to the oldest submitted studies first. If you do have some type of urgent situation involving funding, or if you're a student and you have some time constraints, you can always email the IRB or our director, Rich Corrales, to ask to sort of jump the line, if you will, but it has to be a very valid reason to do so. But you definitely can do that if you need to. And if you do have a just-in-time submission from NIH or the NSF, please contact us at the IRB. We have a special submission process to do that, so that you can get a special type of acknowledgement letter that satisfies the NIH and NSF requirements. We've been doing this for the last several years. That won't require a full submission unless you have a full submission ready, but sometimes you don't have enough time to do that. So we can accommodate that with an acknowledgement letter, and then you could submit a full submission further along down the line. For submitting continuing reviews and modifications, under next steps on the left side of your main study page, you should have the option to choose create modification /CR, continuing review. And this is something I wanted to bring up too, because it is one of the most commonly made mistakes, and it's sort of a click specificity that can cause people, sometimes they'll submit things wrong 3 or 4 times before they do it right. And if we can help prevent that for you, we would like to do that. And as it says here, the first page of these submissions is very important because it cannot be edited after it's completed. If it's not, you have to sort of discard the submission and start over again if you have to make a change there, which is why it's really important on your modifications or continuing reviews to do this first. And under what is the purpose of this modification on this first page for a modification, you want to make sure you choose modification for a modification. And for a continuing review of an ongoing study, you want to choose modification and continuing review even if you're not changing anything, because that happens a lot at continuing review where you're not changing anything. So you think, oh, I'm just going to put continuing review because I'm making no changes to the study. But that CLIC doesn't really allow that. CLIC only allows you to choose the continuing review option only if you are closing the study. And this is what it looks like, that first page. So if you want to do, if you're planning on closing your study, that's the only time you should submit that continuing review option right here, if you're planning on closing your study. For a regular modification, we are not renewing the study for another year, you would choose modification update. And anytime you are renewing your study for another year, whether you're making any changes or not, please choose modification and continuing review. And equally important is the second question on this page, the modification scope. Because again, for whatever reason, Click does, it's kind of like a no take backsies kind of situation, which is incredibly frustrating for all of us, especially the researchers, but on our end too, because we feel bad that we can't change this option for you. But for all modification and continuing review submissions, other parts of the study must be selected. There's only two options. It's other parts of the study or study team members. You can certainly choose both, but you must choose other parts of the study because that opens up all of the future other documents in the study for us to review, such as the consent form and the protocol. If you only pick study team members, the only page we'll see in the whole submission is study team members. We can't see any other documents. And you can't make changes to any other documents as well. So if that is selected incorrectly, you would have to discard your submission and do another one. For modification submissions, you may choose study team members, other parts of the study, or both. And only one modification of each scope can be open at the same time. So you could have a continuing review where you choose other parts of the study, but then you didn't choose study team members, and later you go, oh no, I wanted to add Sally to the study. You can still open a separate modification to add Sally to the study, and that would be reviewed separately, and that's okay. And this is especially good things if you want to refer back to this presentation later, because it's a lot easier to see as opposed to hear and remember. But this would be a good thing to go back to whenever you come across this situation, so that way you can see this in advance and make these particular choices so that you don't have to discard your submission and redo it again. So here's an example of the modification scope. In this case, both scopes are chosen. So someone wants to do a continuing review and they want to do a study team member modification and other parts of the study. So other parts of the study always has to be chosen for modification and continuing review. And you can also choose to do study team member information as well. There are no other scopes. Those are the only two scopes that you have. I'll cover, I know we're probably getting a little bit low on time here, so somehow this flies by really fast. But to briefly, a reportable new information is to be submitted when an adverse event or unanticipated problem occurs within a study. And there's a lot of situation where this happens, where this is shown here. An increase in new risk to the study, any harm that was unexpected, that's a key thing. Because someone may experience harm that is not serious, but could be completely unrelated. You know, someone could have been in a car accident and received an injury, but that doesn't need to be reported to us unless something in the study caused that injury or caused that car accident to happen, for example. If it's completely unrelated, then we don't need an R&I submitted for it. You know, non-compliance, audits by a federal agency, researcher error, reports of a study monitor that are not DSMB reports, Data Safety Monitoring Board reports, those can be submitted with a continuing review, and a couple of these other things shown here. All R&Is must be submitted to the IRB within 5 business days of being aware of the event. When you submit an R&I to us, please be sure to include what happened, why it happened, when and where it happened, what was done to address the issue at the time, and an action plan to prevent that event from occurring again if that fits within what happened. You should also see the option to report new information under next steps from your homepage or your study page, because you want to be able to link your R&I to your specific study. If you do that within your study page, I believe it will automatically do that. But you can also report new information from your homepage where it's not related to any study. So that could be relevant sometimes if it's sort of a lab-wide issue, for example, instead of just tied to one study. But you can do that in either place. So if you have everything completed for your study, if it goes through the pre-review process, you might get a clarification request, comes back to pre-review. Then it comes to us for IRB review, whether that's in full board or for administrator. We could review it and then go back to say, hey, here's some things we need you to change. It'll be in this clarification requested bubble, then go back to us. And then after we approve it, it will go into post review. A full board, if it's in that modifications required, which means it's almost ready to be approved, it might go into that bubble for you to make another change or two. But then it can come right back to post review. And then at the end is review complete. So if you have that review complete button in orange, congratulations, your study's been approved. And you should have an approval letter in your study as well that will state that, because you may need that. And one quick thing I did want to bring up, we can't really make a determination over the phone or via email about this question, which happens all the time. Do I need to submit my study to the IRB? Because if you ask that question, we're going to tell you yes, no matter what, for the most part, other than potentially if you are dealing with cadavers, for example, and there's no identifiers associated with it. But there is a gray area with quality improvement projects. And that is where people usually will ask, hey, do I need to submit my study to the IRB? Because your study might not meet human research requirements. But we always ask and recommend that you submit your study to us, even if you think it is quality improvement, so that you can get an official determination from us. Because we have found that journals are constantly asking for their IRB approval for if someone wants to submit to a quality improvement project for publication. And if you don't have your IRB approval, you can't really do that after the fact, after the research has been conducted. We can look at it at that point and say, well, yes, it's not human research, you're okay. And we can probably give you that determination. But if it turns out that your study was human research and you conducted human research without approval, then that could be trouble for doing so, which is why we always are suggesting that if, when in doubt, to submit your study to the IRB. And in those cases, there might be parts of the 503 protocol that don't apply to your situation, because you might think it's a not human research study, and you can always put not applicable in any section that really doesn't apply, because that happens fairly often. There's no research interventions potentially for not human research or for certain quality improvement projects. So don't be afraid to ask us, but we will always tell you, yes, we strongly suggest that you submit to the IRB to get that official determination from us. And that's everything. I also, so Val Belani is our administrative assistant. That's the general IRB phone number, 888-4888, and the email address, ub-irb@buffalo.edu. My phone number isn't on here, but you can always call me. It's 716-888-4874, or you can email me. It's ZN Chakan, ZNCHAKAN @buffalo.edu. And I'm always happy to answer any questions, take as much time as needed to try to help out, set up Zoom meetings, whatnot, to go through issues, or contact me afterwards. I can give you my contact information if you don't get it here. And Alexis and Marshall are always super helpful as well, and their contact information is here. And I also have other contact information. If you need to, I can supply that to you afterwards. So thank you everyone for your attention. I know there's some of the stuff might be a little dry here, and again, it's a lot easier to see some of this stuff, so I wanted to try to provide some images where appropriate. But you can always go back to this presentation and look at certain things, because it'll make a lot more sense if you're looking at it while actually doing it, or to contact with any questions if you have them. And I think we're right at 11 now, but I'm certainly happy to answer any questions that anybody has from the whole presentation.
So there is one question that just popped up, but before we get to that, before other people log off, I will be sending out a post survey that will have all contact information in it regarding whoever you want to speak to. It will be in there. These surveys are really important for reporting purposes for our funding sources. So when I send them, it only takes about 5 minutes. If you wouldn't mind completing it, send it right back. That'd be appreciated. And we do have one more ORO coming up next month. It will be by Tracy Gross. She's a training coordinator, and it will give more of an overview of Click as like a system and how it works, less IRB specific. So if you're looking on like how to submit, what buttons you're hitting, things like that within Click, that'll be next month on the 11th, same time at 10 a.m. Alexis, if you want to go with the questions, you can.
Yep, if Melissa's still here, she has a question about PIs registering in CSR. You still here? All right, I'll just read out the question then. I can read out the question if you need to add anything. So how do PIs know to register their study in CSR? Do they get a notification with instructions, or are they just supposed to know to do so?
Yeah, so I guess you might know that better than me, Alexis, for sure. But I do know is that if you submit your study and click first, we have the intake coordinators, Serena and Jen. They sort of have a almost automatically generated response to they believe that your study needs to go through central study registration. So they will give you instructions on how to do that and what steps to take within Click while that happens. But I do believe in general, I know there was a big push to try to emphasize central study registration in advance to try to know that. And if you're unsure, I would always recommend just going there first anyway, or contacting Kim or Alexis or Marshall to ask before doing so.
Yeah, and I can give a short answer on that too. All human subjects research that's initiated in the health sciences schools needs to go through CSR, and all clinical trials in any of the other schools has to go through CSR. And as I mentioned earlier, you can get more information from Kim's presentation as well, and we're always available to help. Does that answer your question enough for now? How do they know to reach out? I would say that after you've looked at the information of what proactive steps are being taken. I'm not sure what that means.
Hi, sorry, I'm just gonna talk. So I guess I'm a research administrator for the department. So a lot of times, there's PIs that are really familiar with the process that, know exactly what to do, when to do it. And then there's others that are new to everything. And I feel like just in my experience, a lot of times we find out things after the fact, and then I'm trying to troubleshoot. And so I'm just wondering, like, how do they know to register in CSR from the outset, so they're not having to do double work, submit the IRB protocol, and then get notified that they should have registered it in CSR first. So just wondering if there's anything in place that addresses that currently, or if that's something that could be done, so new PIs are, better informed.
That's why we have these educational materials, is so that people can learn about that. But as Zach mentioned, it doesn't hurt to put it through CSR, because we'll look at it, and if it doesn't need to go through CSR, then you've saved yourself a step of having to put it into Click, because we'll process it as though it needed to go in CSR, and then just put it into Click and let you know that it's there. Like, we'll fill out the form to indicate that it didn't actually need to be processed through CSR.
So do they know to do it in CSI first? That's my question, is like, how do they know? Like, everybody knows IRB protocol. They know they need to submit that, but are they notified? Like, how do they know to do that first step, the CSR step?
It's
how you mentioned, Alexis, especially if it's one of the 5 health sciences schools.
Yeah.
That's one way that you definitely know it needs to go into CSR.
Yeah, I guess I don't think there's I know that there's you have your your resources webpage that talks about it and these educational materials, but I don't know if there's, and you guys have had training sessions, I believe, on this as well. but I don't know if there's any recurring things or anything to let new people know about that, other than just sort of other than looking on the CTSI or CRO website and saying yes, you need to do this for these reasons. I guess, and that's kind of, I think, why we mentioned here that because I think it's several years old now. So some people, yes, are definitely very in tune with the process, but some people don't do a lot of research, and perhaps they may not know that as well. They could get one, I got a grant, great, and I haven't done this in so long, and they may not be aware of, I guess, the process. That could be another situation, or somebody new coming in. So I think I would say it's always, as Marshall says, if it's in one of those health sciences departments, to just submit it anyway, and sort of get that instilled with all the investigators that yes, they should submit this if they fit into one of those categories.
And I'm just thinking another thing too is how you mentioned people, typically know the IRB protocols. If you go online to the IRB's webpage for UB, on there, if you scroll down, it says things about, since 2017, things about it might need to be put into central study registration. And then it gives you a link to the CSR page. And then it gives them tidbits about, you might need to input your study for CSR if it says A, B, or C. So that's another way they could find out too.
So Amanda, I see that your hand is up. If you can unmute yourself.
Sure. Thank you. So I'm a new faculty member. I just joined this semester, and I am on a study right now led by someone at a different university. And so the study went through and was approved by their university. What is the process? Does the process look different in that situation here? I've been at a few places where sort of everyone has a different approach to reviewing protocols that have been reviewed and approved elsewhere. So do I have to go through this whole process? Does the process look different at all in that situation when you're reviewing something that has been approved by another university?
So have you is the study still open at the other university, or are procedures still taking place at that university, or is everything going to get moved here?
So it's led by that university, but I'm a key personnel on it.
Oh,
so
gotcha.
I'll have access to data and we'll be doing some data collection, but it's not being led by this university.
Okay. I would say in that case, there is, because it's possible that we may have some hand in the IRB process, but there is also something we didn't really talk about even today with reliance agreements and having different IRBs review different things. I know in the last several years, especially with the institution of the new common rule a few years ago, they wanted to reduce burden on all these investigators and IRBs for having to review things in multiple places.
Yeah.
So what I would suggest is reaching out to our IRB director. His name is Rich Corrales. His email is karalus@buffalo.edu, and you can describe the situation to him, because he's the director, but he also handles all of these potential reliance agreements between different universities.
Okay. So
that potentially that our IRB does not need to also review a study if it's taking place sort of in multiple locations, and we can sort of cede our IRB review to the institution where the research is primarily happening, so that it's only getting one IRB review.
Okay, great. Yeah, that sounds good.
Yeah, we do have in some of these cases where we do require some information to go into Click, but other than if it's things with injury language or certain UB specific requirements, we don't really review it. There's always local context reviews in that situation, but you may need to sort of submit something to us depending on the situation. Say, hey, yeah, there's this external IRB that's reviewing the study, just so that we have record that it's happening, but we won't be actually conducting the reviews ourselves. Okay. So I would suggest contacting Rich to let him know what you need, because he also handles situations where we are serving as the IRB of record for other sites.
Sure.
As well. So it's especially if you're not transferring a whole study over here, that would be, I would say, step one recommending to do that.
Okay, great. Thank you.
You're welcome. And if you have anything else in regards to that specifically before contacting him, you can always feel free to email me as well.
Okay, thanks.
Sure.
Okay, it doesn't look like there's any more questions. So thank you all for attending and for your great questions. Thank you, Zach, so much. And we look forward to learning more about the IRB from you in future Open Research Office sessions.
Sounds great. Yeah, thanks for having me, and thanks to everyone for your questions and for your attention for all this time here.
Have a wonderful day.
Thanks, everyone.